The text came through as I was setting the table for dinner. My heart stopped when I saw it. She needs our help. I read the words again. She needed help. But why did he have to tell me this way? Why now? My fingers didn't tremble as I held the phone, but my chest felt tight, like there was something trying to break free inside. I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe. "Mom, dinner's ready." My son's voice snapped me back to reality. I didn't flinch, didn't pause. The words on the screen still burned in my mind, but my hands were steady as I set the phone down. I called him down for dinner like any other night, the sound of his steps echoing through the house. There was nothing in my voice to give it away. Then, another text came through. The one that pushed everything over the edge. "She's pregnant, Sophie. We need to be there for her." My stomach dropped, but I didn't let it show. I didn't even blink. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind, spinning, but I forced myself to stay calm. I wasn't going to let him see me break. Not like this. Not for him. I focused on the silverware, the scent of the roasted chicken in the air, the hum of my son's voice in the background. Everything felt so normal. Like nothing had changed. But I knew it had. Everything had changed in an instant. Still, I didn't show it. I simply typed my reply. "Congratulations." No anger. No emotion. Just that one cold word. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a meltdown. Let him think I'd be weak, that I'd beg for answers, that I'd scream at him. But I wouldn't. Not now. Not when I was already 2 steps ahead. The years we spent together seemed to replay in a blur, moments I had once cherished now twisted in a way I couldn't ignore. I had trusted Thomas, loved him with a depth I couldn't even explain. And Lily, she had been my rock after Mom passed, the sister I never thought would betray me. The late nights, the casual touches, the laughter they shared behind my back, looking back, it was all so obvious. But at the time, I never thought twice. Family doesn't betray you, not unless they're already planning to. And that realization hit harder than anything else. We built this life together, Thomas and I never imagined a day when I'd have to fight to keep it. I had sacrificed so much for us, for our future, never once suspecting that my sister and my husband were building their own future on the side. This wasn't just a betrayal. It was a loss. A loss of trust, of years I couldn't get back, of a future I had imagined. But something inside me shifted. I wasn't the same person who had stood by them. I wasn't the same person who had forgiven their mistakes time and time again. The truth was clearer now, and it fueled something inside me. Before I share what happened next, how I planned my next move to reclaim what was mine, I want to hear from you, my amazing viewers. Have you ever been let down by someone you trusted? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, I'm curious to hear how you handled it. And if you're ready to see how I turned my world around, hit that like button. Trust me, this story is just getting started. The first crack appeared quietly, almost unnoticed, buried beneath the surface of our everyday life. It was a small thing, just a receipt tucked into Thomas's jacket pocket, one I hadn't intended to look at but did anyway. A hotel charge from a night he swore he had been out with friends. I remember holding that tiny slip of paper, the edges crinkled in my fingers as my heart sank lower with each passing second. I didn't confront him then. I wasn't ready to lose it all just yet. Instead, I kept my cool, my emotions carefully bottled up, and filed the information away. I'd been patient for years, but now, I couldn't afford to be blind any longer. I couldn't allow myself to be the fool. Slowly, silently, I began to prepare. While Thomas stayed late at work, thinking I was none the wiser, I set up a new savings account, one he couldn't touch. I kept just enough in the joint account to keep things under control, enough to stop him from getting suspicious. I had suspected something for months, but now, I knew. This wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal that threatened everything we'd built. And I was done waiting for him to pull the rug out from under me. The moment had arrived, and I was ready. Thomas had no idea what was coming. With a quiet sense of satisfaction, I made my first move. I froze all the shared accounts, everything he thought he had access to, now completely out of his reach. He was so sure he had emptied everything, but the real money, the money that mattered, was safe and sound. He would never see it. Next, I locked him out of the house. I could almost hear him, standing outside, fumbling with his keys as he realized they no longer worked. The house, our home, had always been mine, even when we'd talked about putting his name on the deed. I had always brushed it off, telling him we'd deal with it later. Well, later was now. And now, the house was mine, and it always had been. I smiled to myself as I thought of him, believing he had won. But the game wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the time he realized what had happened, I'd already taken steps that he couldn't undo. He thought I was the one who had lost, but I was the one who had already won. The messages started pouring in, each one more desperate than the last. Thomas was scrambling, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. When his first text arrived, asking for my understanding, I barely glanced at it before typing my response. I understand. You're right. She needs your support. No anger, no pleading, just a simple acknowledgement that his words meant nothing to me anymore. When Lily reached out, her voice trembling, I kept my tone steady, telling her I didn't hate her, even though every fiber of my being wanted to scream at her. Instead, I felt pity for her, a young woman caught up in something she didn't fully understand. Take care of yourself, I said softly, before hanging up. There was nothing left to say. As for Thomas, his texts became more frantic, but I didn't flinch. He was trying to pull me back into his mess, hoping I'd fall apart, hoping I'd beg for him to come home. But I wasn't playing his game anymore. I wasn't the woman he had left behind. I was stronger now, and this time, the only thing I would give him was a reminder of how little I cared. As the days passed, the consequences of my actions started to unfold, and I could almost feel the weight of Thomas's world crumbling. He thought he had everything under control, but the truth was, he had underestimated me. While he was busy convincing himself that he had won, I was already a few steps ahead. The silence between us grew, and with each passing hour, I knew he was scrambling, trying to make sense of what had happened. He hadn't expected me to act so quickly, to have already taken the reins, to have already set everything in motion. I watched him lose his grip, and though a part of me almost felt sorry for him, I quickly dismissed it. He deserved this. The house was mine, the money was mine, and soon, everything he thought he could take would slip further out of his reach. His phone calls went unanswered. His texts, increasingly desperate, were left read but not replied to. He was a man slowly losing everything, and all the while, I stood firm, watching the truth finally settle in. He had played himself, and now, he was the one who had to live with the fallout. The final pieces fell into place with a satisfying clarity, and as I watched everything unfold, I realized just how far I had come. The house was mine, the divorce finalized, and my future, once clouded by doubt and betrayal, was now wide open, full of possibility. Thomas, still fumbling for control, had no idea what to do next. He had lost everything he thought he could take from me, and now, all he had left were broken promises and empty excuses. I, on the other hand, was thriving. My business was growing, my days no longer clouded by fear or regret, and my nights were mine again, free from the weight of his deceit. It felt like a rebirth. The woman who had once walked on eggshells, afraid of confrontation, was now standing tall, unapologetically strong. As I looked forward, I knew I was only just beginning. There was no looking back, no longing for what had been, no regrets for what was lost. I was finally free, and for the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling suffocated by his lies. This wasn't just a victory over him. It was a victory for me. As the days wore on, the truth of Thomas's downfall became clearer, and I couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction at the way everything had spiraled out of control for him. I had watched the man who once seemed untouchable crumble, piece by piece, as if his whole life had been built on a house of cards. But the difference was, I wasn't there to pick up the pieces. I didn't even care to watch him try. He had taken everything I had given him, the love, the trust, the years of my life, and thrown it all away as if it meant nothing. Now, he was left with nothing but his lies, his guilt, and the sharp realization that he would never be able to undo the mess he'd made. The calls started to grow more frantic. His texts, once filled with false promises and manipulative pleas, became bitter, almost pleading for sympathy. But I wasn't buying it. He thought he could waltz back into my life, expecting me to open the door and let him in, as if I hadn't already seen through him. He had underestimated me for so long, but now, with everything on the line, he had finally pushed me too far. And then there was Lily. Poor, naive Lily, still believing in the fairy tale Thomas had spun for her. It was almost laughable, watching her spin around in his web, desperate for his approval, only to realize, far too late, that she was nothing more than a placeholder. A brief escape for a man who was running away from his own consequences. I had to listen to her voice crack over the phone, begging for forgiveness, apologizing for a betrayal she was too young to understand. But none of it mattered. I wasn't her mother, and I wasn't going to play the role of the martyr. As for Thomas, his recklessness knew no bounds. The more I watched, the more I realized just how little he understood about the mess he had made. His so-called new life was already falling apart at the seams. The grand plans he'd made with Lily, plans to escape to some new reality, were as flimsy as his promises to me. As the eviction notices piled up, I couldn't help but smile. The man who had once thrown our family away like it was nothing was now begging for a place to stay, scrambling for money, and quickly realizing that he had no safety net left. His credit was ruined, his future in tatters, and all he had left were empty words. I was free. He was not. And the best part? He had no idea what was coming next. His illusions of control were shattered. The financial fallout from his greed was just the beginning, and as the final blow landed, I knew he would be left wondering how he could have possibly been so blind, so arrogant, to think he could walk away unscathed. This wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a story of a man who had tried to destroy everything I had, only to find himself buried beneath the weight of his own lies. And I was more than happy to let him drown in it. As I watched Thomas stumble through the wreckage of his own creation, it was impossible to ignore the absurdity of it all. He had orchestrated this entire downfall, convinced he could have it all, me, Lily, the house, the money, without facing the consequences. But now, as his world unraveled, it was becoming clear just how much he had miscalculated. The facade he had built around himself was crumbling, and with it, every ounce of his dignity. He tried to cling to the remnants of his once comfortable life, but they slipped through his fingers like sand. The credit card bills piled up, his once pristine reputation began to tarnish, and his so-called new family with Lily was already falling apart. He had promised her stability, a future, yet here they were, struggling, desperate, with nothing but shattered dreams to show for it. And in his desperation, Thomas began to make reckless decisions, thinking he could somehow escape the consequences of his actions. But there was no escape. Not for him. Not anymore. Lily, too, quickly realized that she had been nothing more than a pawn in Thomas's game. He had played her, just as he had played me, but now, with the harsh reality of their situation staring them both in the face, she was beginning to see the truth. It was almost painful to watch as she called me, voice quivering, asking for advice, asking for sympathy, when all I could feel was pity for her naivety. She had been so eager to believe in the fairy tale he had sold her, but the reality was much darker, and she was starting to see it. And I couldn't save her from it. This was her lesson to learn. Thomas's calls grew more erratic, each one more frantic than the last. His desperation was palpable. He begged for forgiveness, he begged for a second chance, but I couldn't help but laugh at his pathetic attempts to manipulate me into feeling sorry for him. He had made his bed, and now he would lie in it. I knew the man I had married. I knew what he was capable of, and I wasn't about to let him rewrite history, not now, not after everything he had done. Then came the final blow, the moment I knew he truly understood how far gone he was. He had nowhere left to turn. He was alone, stranded with nothing but his own choices to blame. His attempts to manipulate me into helping him were met with silence, and that silence was his answer. The woman he had tried to break, the woman he thought he could control, she wasn't broken. She wasn't begging for him to come back. She was thriving. While Thomas and Lily were left to drown in the mess they had created, I moved forward, unburdened. I wasn't going to waste another second thinking about them. They were the past. I was the future. And as Thomas continued to spiral, as his every plan fell apart around him, I knew that I had come out on top. I had reclaimed my life, my dignity, my future, and I was only just getting started. As the final pieces of their downfall fell into place, Thomas and Lily's lives crumbled in ways neither had anticipated. For Thomas, every move he made only seemed to dig him deeper into the hole he had created. His once promising new life was now a series of broken promises, unpaid bills, and a growing pile of regrets. The man who thought he could get away with everything was now struggling to find a place to sleep, relying on friends who were growing weary of his presence. His credit was in ruins, his job prospects dwindling, and the weight of his past decisions finally pressing down on him. He had no more safety nets, no more chances to play the victim. The life he thought he could rebuild was slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Lily, too, found herself facing the stark reality of what she had done. Her attempts to reach out to Sophie had only deepened her guilt, but she had burned bridges that couldn't be repaired. In the end, she was left standing in the wreckage of a family she had torn apart, her naive belief in Thomas's promises now shattered. The life she had imagined with him was a lie, and Sophie was right, she had to live with the consequences of her choices. No apologies, no regrets could erase the betrayal. The truth was, Thomas had never truly loved her, he had just used her as a means to escape the reality he had created with Sophie. As for Sophie, she stood on the other side, stronger than she had ever been. She had taken the shattered remnants of her old life and rebuilt herself into something new, something unbreakable. Her business flourished, her confidence grew, and her future stretched out before her like an open road. She had finally reclaimed what was hers, not just the house or the money, but her peace, her sense of self. She had made it through the storm, and now, there was nothing left to hold her back. One final message arrived, from Thomas, just as Sophie was putting the final touches on her latest business plan. It was simple, desperate. "We need to talk." Sophie stared at the screen for a long moment, the words flashing before her. She had nothing left to say to him. Nothing he could offer would ever change what had happened, nothing could undo the damage he had caused. She had no reason to open that door again, no reason to let him back into her life. The woman he had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by someone who knew her worth. With a slow, deliberate motion, she deleted the message. The final tie was cut, and as she looked out the window at the city skyline, Sophie knew it was over. No more calls. No more texts. No more lies. She was free. And for the first time in years, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Sophie smiled to herself, took a deep breath, and set her phone down. She had walked through fire, and now she was living her truth. This was her victory, and nothing, no one, could ever take it from her again.